In 1947, the Doomsday Clock was created by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. The clock stands as a warning to the world at large of how close we are at any given moment to destroying our world with our own dangerous technologies. In October 1962, for a period of 13 days, the minute hand of the Doomsday Clock inched itself to 7 minutes to midnight. This was in response to the ever-increasing threat of global nuclear war, which had as its focal point the island of Cuba, situated in the Caribbean, just 90 miles from US shores. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a tense period of standoff during the Cold War between global superpowers, the United States of America and the Soviet Union. The crisis arose over the Soviet Union's plans to deliver nuclear missiles to various sites across Cuba. These missiles would have been able to reach targets across the eastern territory of the United States within a few short minutes of being launched. Cuba itself was a perennial thorn in the side of Americans after leftist leader Fidel Castro seized power in 1959 and aligned his nation with communism and the Soviet Union. Cuba itself was no threat to the American dream, but its larger, more powerful ally, the Soviet Union, most certainly was. The decision by Soviet Union leader Nikita Khrushchev to deploy medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles in Cuba was in response to the US nuclear armament stockpiles in Italy and Turkey, as well as the failed Bay of Pigs invasion financed and directed by the US government, in which Cuban exiles attempted to overthrow Fidel Castro and install a new, Western-friendly government. The presence of the missiles were first discovered by American U-2 spy plane pilot Major Richard Haser, while flying a reconnaissance mission over Cuba on the 14th of October 1962. Upon learning of this, US President John F. Kennedy immediately formed an executive committee, or ExComm, and for the next 2 weeks deliberated on an appropriate response to the unacceptable situation. The options considered included a full-scale US invasion of Cuba, or a US air attack targeting the Cuban missile sites, but these were quickly ruled out as being too likely to lead to global military conflict. The US, however, could not sit back and do nothing, for it was not only the proximity of nuclear missiles to American shores that posed a problem. Kennedy also had to consider the situation in Germany. Berlin was another focal point of the Cold War, and the concern of the US was that any military reaction to the situation in Cuba could prompt the Soviet Union to conquer Berlin. On the 22nd of October 1962, Kennedy informed the US public of the discovery of the missiles and announced the decision to implement a naval quarantine around Cuban territorial waters. This was designed to prevent Soviet ships carrying armaments from reaching Cuba. Kennedy further demanded the withdrawal by the Soviet Union of all missiles already delivered. Over the next few days, the standoff escalated, with Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanging various letters demanding of the other to stand down and appealing against instigating a global thermonuclear war. The US Navy implemented its blockade around Cuba and began intercepting various vessels and checking for nuclear weapons. On the 24th of October 1962, the US raised the readiness level of Strategic Air Command Forces to DEFCON 2, the highest it has ever been. Following hours of tense standoff, Soviet freighters carrying nuclear armaments turned back towards Europe and did not attempt to break through the blockade. On the 27th of October 1962, a nuclear-armed Soviet B-59 submarine was operating within international waters near Cuba and lost communication with Moscow, and the captain believed war may have already broken out. If not for the decision of second-in-command flotilla chief Vasily Arkhipov, the Soviets may have then launched a nuclear torpedo at US Navy ships, sparking a global conflict. That same day, the 27th of October 1962, tensions escalated to new heights when US U-2 aircraft pilot Major Rudolph Anderson was shot down and killed. With first blood having been drawn, it seemed that at this point war was inevitable. Kennedy and his advisors, however, concluded that the order to shoot down the US plane had not come from Khrushchev himself, but was the doing either of the Cuban military or an unidentified Soviet commander in Cuba acting on his own authority. As such, Kennedy chose not to retaliate with force. The world leaders, both realizing the inevitability of mutually assured destruction, managed to reach an agreement to de-escalate the situation. The Soviet Union agreed to dismantle and remove their missiles from Cuba, whereas the US guaranteed not to invade Cuba and to remove its own Jupiter missiles stationed in Italy and Turkey. While the immediate threat of nuclear catastrophe was thus avoided, the Cold War continued to drag on for decades. In the wake of the crisis, the famous Red Telephone, a direct hotline between the leaders of the USA and the USSR, was installed to defuse future similar situations. It was only in 1963 that the Doomsday Clock was set back to 12 minutes to midnight after the US and the Soviet Union signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty. This signaled a joint admission that cooperation was key in avoiding a global nuclear catastrophe.